My name is Lingxi Chenyang. I am an associate professor here at SJ Quinney College of Law, and I'll be moderating our panel titled The Health Toll of Polluted Air. This is a very important topic, and one that University of Utah researchers across campus have done really important work on. I was especially alarmed to read a study published last November by researchers at the College of Medicine and the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences that a 10 parts per billion increase in ozone exposure for pregnant persons was associated with a more than 50% higher likelihood of intellectual disability and children. And to help us make sense of this finding and others implicating the health toll of polluted air, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this panel. First, we have Professor John C. Lin. He is the professor in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences here at the University of Utah, as well as the associate director for the Wilkes Center for Climate Science and Policy. He'll talk to us about the different kinds of pollution in different seasons along the Wasatch Front and the impact of climate change on air pollution. Next, we'll have Professor Robert Paine III. Professor Paine is the John M. Huntsman Presidential Chair and Professor of Internal Medicine and Chief at the Division of Respiratory, Critical Care, and Occupational Pulmonary Medicine at the University of Utah Hospital. He will talk to us about the health effects of short versus long-term exposure to air pollution and the impact of different particulates on human health. And finally, we'll have Professor Susana Ramírez, who is the Associate Professor of Public Health Communication at the University of California, Merced. And she'll talk to us about why communication about the risks of air pollution is failing and what we can do about it. So with that, Professor Lin, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Lingxi, and also wanted to thank the previous speakers because I think they've teed up my presentation really well. What I'm going to do is build on what they've presented and provide you sort of a primer on pollution events along the Wasatch Front. And as Daniel mentioned earlier, there are many forms of pollution, and it varies depending on season. So I'm going to sort of do a little bit deeper dive on each one of them and sort of march you through the different seasons. Now, in spring and fall, some of the dominant forms of pollution are in the form of dust events. In the summer, there's ozone and wildfire smoke. And then in the winter, the inversion events. Now, I just want to point out also, the division between the seasons is not sort of perfect. You know, you would have pollution events bleeding into different seasons. You could have a dust event in the middle of winter, in the summer. So this is not a perfect division, but these are some of the dominant forms in different seasons. So wanted to start off with this photo. Where was this taken? Probably familiar to many of you. Well, yes, I think maybe Rob gets the prize. Okay, so this is taken from Little Cottonwood. Beautiful view in general of our canyons, but unfortunately also these pollution events. So this is taken from Little Cottonwood when you're driving up to Snowbird and Alta, and you look back, and this could be what you see. So this is during one of those inversion events, and you can see the haze down in the valley floor, much clearer higher up, higher elevation. And why is this? Well, there's a very strong meteorological or atmospheric explanation for this. This is the inversion event. What's an inversion event? It means that you have warm air sitting on top of cold air. Warm air is less dense. Okay, so the less dense air is sitting on top of cold air. So this is a very stable configuration. It takes a lot of energy to mix this. So the pollution accumulates over days or sometimes even a week or two, and you get what you see on the bottom there in the valley floor. Okay, it's called an inversion because it's inverted from the normal condition, which is cool air on top of warm air. So let's look at what is in that air, in the haze. Okay, this is what we call particulate matter, or PM. Okay, this has been mentioned several times already. But fine particulate matter is sometimes also referred to as PM 2.5. The 2.5 refers to the diameter of these particulates. It's very small. How small? You can sort of compare it with a strand of human hair. Okay, so it's fine enough that it can make it past your nasal hair, the mucus, and penetrate deep in your respiratory system. Okay, so there are real health consequences for that, and I'm pretty sure Rob will talk about that in the next talk. You have also something else called PM10, larger. These are things like dust, mold, pollen, etc. And these are larger particles, but both share the characteristic that they are solids or liquids, so they are not gases. Okay, and that'll become important because these particulates can scatter sunlight. And it's because of this scattering that you have this haze that it's so noticeable, right? We stop seeing our beautiful mountains because the particulate matter scatters the sunlight. So the source of light from the mountains gets scattered. It doesn't reach our eyes. That's why we stop seeing the mountains. Okay, so there's a very strong visual cue to our pollution problem in the wintertime. And as Daniel has already mentioned, we in atmospheric science have been pretty out front in trying to confront this problem. So we have the wonderful TRAX measurements. This is another visualization of that data. This is on the red line, and the colors are actually the level of PM 2.5 during one of those inversion events. This is February of 2016, and you can see some higher values downtown, and it goes to lower values as you move sort of to the southwest of the valley. Okay, so this urban to suburban type of gradient. Okay. Now, what's interesting is about a week later, on Valentine's Day 2016, still during the inversion event, you get something very different. So I'm just going to flip back and forth. Okay, you can see the real contrast in pollution. Okay, in this case, we had polluted air coming from Utah Valley. Okay, that's not suggesting we always get polluted air from Utah Valley. We can get clean air, which was the case about a week earlier. So it just illustrates the dynamic nature of pollution, even during an inversion event, and how important it is to characterize the variability in space and time that Daniel also mentioned earlier. Okay, and the TRAX platform and the eBus platform he mentioned is so good, wonderful ways to measure this. And I'll just highlight how unique that measurement is. Really, we here in Salt Lake have some of the world's best monitoring in terms of air quality. And it's really something we're very proud of from a science perspective. But of course, it doesn't mean much if that doesn't translate into better health and better living quality for our residents. But we're trying to provide the information to do that. Okay, let's move on to spring and fall. So this is where we have our dominant dust events. So this is one of those. I took it not far from here. We're sort of down to the left bottom. That's where we are right now, the law school building. This is taken from my office looking west. So you would expect beautiful views of Oakers, right? But we don't see it, okay? Same reason, okay? These are the PM10 dust particles scattering the sunlight, okay? Obscuring our view. And has been mentioned multiple times, there are concerns about the Great Salt Lake, the decline of the Great Salt Lake and dust emissions from the lake bed, okay? And again, we've tried to work hard on this, and led by sociologist Sarah Gonetsky here on campus, and with several others, including Kevin Perry, I see in the back there, we have tried to quantify the impact of the Great Salt Lake dust on exposure here. Okay, so what I'm showing you here on the left is a comparison of how much additional dust you'll get if the lake completely disappears, which, hopefully never happens. But that's sort of a very clear worst case scenario. Once you do that calculation using an atmospheric model, you can quantify how much additional dust you'll get from the lake. And that's what you get. And these are pretty significant values if you understand the microgram per meter cube type of units, okay? But importantly, as you see in the pattern, the different parts of the Salt Lake Valley Watson Front are not equal in terms of exposure. There's a clear indication of additional exposure, more exposure on the west side of Salt Lake City, okay, Salt Lake Valley. Okay, so there's the real unequal burden for populations. And a natural solution, of course, is kind of a nature-based one where let's fill up the lake. Okay, so that's what we have on the right, sort of the flip side of it. If we bring the current level of the lake up to what's known as optimal, okay, if you're interested in what we mean by optimal, I encourage you to read the Great Salt Lake Strike Team report. That there's sort of a optimal level of the lake when it's not flooding, but also it's not dry and low. Okay, so if you bring it up, then there's a real lowering of the dust exposure during these pretty severe events. Okay, the blue color is the decrease in the dust concentrations. Okay, now let's move on to the summer now. Okay, and I think this is kind of a real complement to an image that I think, the first image that I think Daniels showed by the foothills, I think. So this is in the summer, actually last summer, when we went hiking as a family, again, to Alta, and this is Albion Basin, beautiful wildflowers. But if you notice, if you look at that background sky, there's kind of a haze to it, okay? So this is wildfire smoke, okay? And what's really different about the wildfire smoke, if you contrast that with the wintertime inversion photo, is the smoke is aloft. It covers a wide region as well. There are times in the western US, large parts are covered by wildfire smoke. This is because of the regional nature of wildfire smoke. You can have sources in California, Oregon, Washington State, Montana, British Columbia, you name it. Of course, Utah as well. And that smoke can blanket large swaths of the western US and sometimes even make it to the eastern US, right? So this is, of course, a real concern, exposure to the smoke and PM 2.5 from the smoke. And we've done a fair bit of calculations and understanding of the wildfire smoke. First of all, the wildfire smoke, the PM from it is increasing in the past 2 decades. Okay, in the population centers of Western US, here, this is Spokane, Washington, in that green triangle, it's getting worse. Certainly true also in Salt Lake City. Okay, and we're able to trace with the atmospheric sort of computer model where that additional pollution is coming from. And clearly, it's from wildfire smoke. Okay, so you see those reddish areas? Those are the hot spots where fires took place. Okay, and another thing you see is the cross-border nature of this wildfire smoke transport. We're getting smoke from British Columbia, we're getting it from across the state. Okay, so it's very much a regional problem. So that was wildfire smoke. Let's talk about ozone. Okay, Lingxi mentioned at the outset ozone exposure, and this is very much a serious issue right now to pay attention to. But briefly, the science of ozone is such that it's formed chemically in the atmosphere. Okay, it's not directly emitted. It's formed from chemical reactions, and it proceeds at a faster rate at higher temperatures and with more sunlight. Okay, so naturally you would expect ozone to peak in the summer. Okay. In fact, the worst times are the late afternoons in the summer, early evenings, okay, when the atmosphere has time to bake throughout the whole day. Okay, so that's when we have the highest level of ozone. And what's really striking from an atmospheric science point of view is how stubborn ozone has been over time. Okay, I'm showing you a record, a really wonderful record of ozone from the Hawthorne former elementary school. Okay, so Hawthorne Elementary, the former elementary school, is at 700 East, 1700 South. Okay, that has been the premier air quality site in Salt Lake City, if not the entire state. Okay, we have wonderful record of air quality from this place. And we as scientists think this record is really, really valuable for reasons like this. We can show from the same site, ozone has not declined for the past 20 years, okay? And interesting is what you see in contrast is another typical pollutant, which is NOx. That's the orange line there, okay? Orange line decreases precipitously, really clearly. That's because we have cleaner engines pretty much. You know, we're all driving cleaner cars, and that has contributed to the decline in NOx. So that's a great story. But you might ask, why does ozone hang around so high? Why does it keep on high? And it's sort of, really briefly, it's due to the complex chemistry, the different sources. I don't have time to get into it, but that's something we as a university are working hard on, okay, to try to understand how we can decrease ozone in the upcoming years. Okay, so let's recap now. We have the 4 dominant forms of pollution in the different seasons. Okay, dust, ozone, PM 2.5 from wildfire smoke, and also the inversion-related PM 2.5. Okay, but we do have another big gorilla in the room that I haven't mentioned at all, okay, which is climate change. Okay, so climate change is likely to exacerbate these pollution events. Okay, so here I want to ask you, the audience, if you can raise your hand, and can you think of ways in which climate change can exacerbate air quality challenges? Yeah.
So the rising heat.
Thank you. Yeah. So the increasing temperature is clearly going to exacerbate ozone. There's lots and lots of sort of scientific studies showing that. And I think Daniel showed a figure as well from his talk. What else? I think I saw, yeah. More CO2 in the atmosphere. Yes, but indirectly. So CO2 is a contributor to climate change. It's the main greenhouse gas. CO2 by itself does not have health issues. So it's sort of indirectly, yes. But I think I saw another hand here. Yeah. Wildfire impacts. Yeah. So one of the main drivers of why wildfires are getting worse is because of climate change. The hotter temperatures, the drier fuels, are making wildfires worse. There's very strong evidence for that. The other sort of human impact is sort of Smokey the Great Bear, right? We've been suppressing wildfires, so you have a buildup of fields. So that's not exactly climate change, but climate change hand in hand with the human intervention has made things worse. I think I see another, yeah. Yeah, so the comment there, if you haven't heard, is the warmer temperature increasing the indoor cooling needs, okay, the power needs, and that sort of provides a feedback loop to increase sort of greenhouse gas emission, and that's completely correct. It doesn't, again, directly affect the air quality. I was thinking about something very direct. Yeah, in the back, probably the last one. Yeah, you. Sorry, Yeah, directly. The climate change causes something that makes air quality directly worse. Sorry, can you speak up? Oil refineries. Maybe I think I can understand this. So the climate change making the need to refine more oil, causing more. Is that where you're getting at? Kind of, but the oil refinery, our local oil refineries are important. They are a really small component of many things. So I'm thinking about something, maybe last one, and I'll give you the answer. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sorry? Dry and dustier. Okay. Yes, you got what I was looking for. So the Great Salt Lake, right? So climate change. So I think we've hit all three now. Climate change will likely increase evaporation from the lake. So while right now, climate change is not the biggest player in the decline of the lake, we are as humans, it's not climate change. In the future, as climate change proceeds, it's likely it'll play a bigger role and challenging role for the lake. Okay, so let me, in the interest of time, close now, but I want to close with I think a wonderful quote from Wallace Stegner, and I think it's very fitting given the namesake of this symposium. So this is a quote from Wallace Stegner, who talks about the importance of hope, okay, and how much of a defining feature that is for the West. Okay, so we have these really challenging problems with air quality, climate change. But there's a lot of hope if we quote Wallace Stegner, and it leads to cooperation. We have hope because there's a lot of history of cooperation in the West. And I think it's epitomized by this forum, okay, the cooperation between experts as well as public in sharing ideas. And then I think with that, we can now have a chance to create a society to match our wonderful scenery. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you, John. Next, we have Professor Paine.
Thank you, John. That was great. So I get to take a few minutes to talk about the health toll of polluted air. And I trust I don't have to convince all of you that air pollution is bad for human health. I'll start off assuming that we have some agreement on that. There's an enormous amount of data that supports it. Happy to give you more information about that. But I'm going to take this opportunity to drill down a little further and get you to think about some of the different variables involved and how to understand the impact on human health a little more based on some of the differences, for instance, that John has talked about and that our earlier speakers had talked about. One of the variables to think about is different time frames. And I think we need to separate out the notion of short-term exposures versus longer-term exposures. And short-term meaning hours to days, and longer-term years. Now, in my remarks, I'm going to focus on particulate pollution because there's so much data about that, and it's such a big deal for us for human health. I'm not discounting ozone. Ozone's very important, but the particulates make a very nice story, and it's an area where we really need to focus. So short-term exposure to ozone, we know, it triggers a number of acute events. These are particularly important for the children with asthma we were hearing about this morning, adults with asthma as well, for folks with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or cigarette-related lung disease, heart attacks, strokes. And when people are exposed to higher levels of particulate pollution, even for a few hours, we see increase in number of ER visits, increase in hospitalizations, and increase in deaths. And for these short-term exposures, we particularly focus on vulnerable populations, those who have pre-existing heart disease or lung disease, and also the very young, the elderly, and pregnant mothers. The longer-term exposures are a little more subtle because the levels of pollution that we track for longer-term exposures are actually much lower. They're about a third the level that we get excited about for the short-term exposures. But we know that those long-term exposures are terribly important for health, both for mortality, for the initiation of a number of different diseases. And that their effects are particularly involving cardiopulmonary health and cancer mortality. So I'm going to show you a little bit of data. This is a study that I think is very helpful in terms of short-term air pollution exposure. This is a large study. They looked at 600 cities all over the world, and they said, okay, we're going to track air quality, and we're going to do a rolling 2-day average and just look at mortality rates and see what those are in all these different communities. And we're going to look at all-cause mortality. We're not going to worry about exactly what people died from. Now, in this graph, those vertical dotted lines are different standards for air quality, and the U.S. National Ambient Air Quality Standards are there in, I guess it's a blue, the second to the left, and at a level of 35 micrograms per cubic meter. The World Health Organization wants us to be more stringent, and you can see other groups that are less stringent. And I think the graph shows you that the worse the air quality is, the higher the mortality rate is. More people are dying. But one of the things that's particularly interesting and important about this curve has to do with this bottom part. This bottom part is down in an area where we say, oh, this is safe air quality. We meet everybody's standards. It's fine. But you'll notice it's not a plateau. It's not flat. There's still a very steep curve. In fact, it's the steepest portion of the curve. So the message here is that any air pollution is bad and increases mortality rate. It also means that any changes we make, you get a bigger bang for your buck if you improve air quality, even if you already have good air quality in the first place. So yeah, there is no safe air level of air pollution. We need to keep after it, even when we're adhering to all the regulatory standards. So I want to move from short-term exposure to long-term exposure. And this is some old data from, I guess this was published in the early 90s. And this was from something called the Harvard 6 City Studies. And on this graph, you see initials for 6 cities across the United States. And they tracked air quality in terms of average particulate pollution versus mortality rate. That rate ratio on the vertical axis is relative mortality. And they controlled for everything: insurance, water, all the other issues that might affect health, and said, okay, how important is air quality? And there's a remarkable straight line here that says the worse your air quality, the higher your mortality rate. And this holds up. It's held up with reevaluation. It holds up with, if you look at averages over many years versus averages over just a couple years previous. So yes, higher air pollution levels are terrible for human health. Here's another table that just shows you the same sort of thing. This is a large study that said, okay, for every 10 microgram per cubic meter increase in our PM 2.5, these small particles, how much does mortality increase? And they looked at deaths in 2000, and they looked at exposure levels 20 years before and exposure levels just in the 2 years before. And you see for all-cause mortality, the higher the average PM 2 point level, the higher the mortality. For cardiopulmonary disease, same thing. For heart attacks, ischemic heart disease, and also for cancer. So living with higher levels of pollution, and again, even within ranges that are considered safe, you end up with higher mortality rates across broad communities. Another variable I want you to think about is who's breathing the air. Okay, now we spend a lot of time talking about vulnerable populations, and the answer is pretty much anyone with a pre-existing condition, especially heart disease, cardiovascular disease involving strokes and things, or any lung disease. You are vulnerable if you're exposed to worse air quality. We also know that poor air quality can actually contribute to the development of these, but it can contribute to the acute events that cause you problems. We know the elderly and the very young are susceptible, and as we heard just a little bit ago, lots of data, particularly from Utah, showing that pregnant women are susceptible. You get low birth weight babies, you get premature babies, and I thought it was important, some of the earlier speakers have talked about economic impact. Realize that every time you have a premature baby, there's the terrible health effects we see, but there's also often a lifelong consequence with need for community support for that child, or a lower IQ and a smaller contribution to the workforce and to the broader economy. So as we think about it, there's tremendous economic outcomes from these pregnancy effects. But I'd also argue we are all vulnerable, and that the long-term effects of air pollution affect all of us. So the focus on vulnerable populations, yes, it's important. It's particularly important for short-term pollution exposures. But we shouldn't say, oh, that's just affecting other people. This is affecting all of us. Now, John did a nice job of introducing some of the seasonal things. It's very important to recognize that all particles are not the same. We're used to talking about industrial sources, and we're very quick to blame industrial sources, and they deserve a lot of blame. But we are all part of this because our mobile sources, our cars and trucks, are terribly important in Utah. They are the biggest contributors to the particulate pollution we have during our inversions. We also know agricultural dusts are important, dust from the Great Salt Lake as it dries, and then wildfire. Now, there are several key characteristics about the particles. They aren't all the same. Size matters. We talk about PM 2.5 because 2.5 microns is a perfect size to bypass all the upper airway defenses and get out into the peripheral lung. But even smaller particles have a particularly big effect. Now, it's interesting when you look at wildfire smoke versus urban pollution, wildfire smoke actually has smaller particles and may get a heavier deposition of the particles in the lung for any given level that we measure in the air of PM 2.5. The wildfire may be worse than urban pollution. It's also important what they carry. These particles aren't inert. They carry things into the lung. We know from the Great Salt Lake there's concern about arsenic and other heavy metals. Also other toxic materials. Wildfire smoke, particularly at the urban-rural interface, is full of all sorts of carcinogens and other toxic materials that get in and are carried in with those particles. And then there are also differences in the particles depending on how they're generated, even among urban pollutants. So some particles cause more inflammation in the lungs, some cause more oxidative stress. In our inversions, John didn't get into it, but we have both primary particles and then particles that develop from the chemical soup in the air during the inversion. And those secondary particles that are hanging out there are actually maybe more toxic than the primary particles. They're more heavily associated with heart attacks, for instance. And then the final point I'll make is air pollution affects humans in so many different ways. This is a figure showing how many different organ systems are impacted by air pollution and how much more disease we see. The bolded ones are the ones where there's really solid data. The ones that aren't bolded, it's almost certain those are true, but the data isn't quite as strong. And we don't understand always the relationship between the particular pollutant exposure and how that organ system is affected. And we're going to learn more about that, and we'll be learning more about that with some of the research going on here, for instance. But just remember, yes, we talk about heart attacks, we talk about asthma, but we also end up with, it worsens diabetes, it worsens strokes, it may accelerate intellectual decline over time. So air pollution is not good for human health. It causes many kinds of problems, and we need to be aware of the different kinds of pollution and the different effects that they have. So on that, I'll stop and look forward to hearing about how we can communicate more effectively about all this and our problems with communication. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Next, we have Professor Ramírez.
A little depressed now, but I'm very honored to join this distinguished panel. As a scholar of health communication, my work focuses on how the information environment shapes how people understand and respond to public health threats like air pollution. We all, I think if we didn't come in convinced, we are now convinced that air pollution harms human health. Here in the Wasatch Front and where I live, which is in the heart of California, right in the middle of the Great Central Valley, the part of the state that we call the San Joaquin Valley, which is a valley just like where we are right now, where we experience many of the same air quality challenges. It's actually amazing how much is really similar. We are also consistently in the country's and world's most polluted regions. And yet, despite overwhelming evidence and really visible pollution episodes, we face a persistent gap between awareness and action. And so I contend understanding the health risks and acting on them are two very different things. So I'm going to focus on why communication about air pollution is failing and what we might be able to do about it. So research has consistently shown that people living in highly polluted areas often underestimate the health risks of air pollution, or they misunderstand them entirely. In other words, I'm talking about regular people, non-scientists, regular citizens who are living amidst pollution. We know, we can feel when air quality is bad. We feel sick. We have our kids have more frequent asthma episodes. They are more severe asthma episodes. And so this makes air pollution an important source of concern because we're feeling it and we're experiencing it. We can see it for many types of pollution. But on the other hand, again, as regular citizens, we don't have access to clear and actionable information to protect us from these harmful effects. And so my research has identified three critical barriers in communicating about air pollution. First, there is widespread confusion about information sources. Who exactly is supposed to be communicating about air quality? In studies that we conducted in California's San Joaquin Valley, we found that neither residents, everyday people, nor experts, and I'm talking about the kind of people who are presenting at the symposium, right? So neither everyday non-scientist people nor experts were able to name the organizations who were responsible for communicating about air pollution. No one knew. It's like, not really passing the buck because we didn't even know who to pass it to. And so without clear authority, the public is left uncertain about where to turn for reliable guidance. And I'll say that if there's one thing that we as a society have learned in the last 5 years, it's that the absence of clear, trusted authorities communicating clearly opens the door to charlatans peddling misinformation and sowing doubt about the very nature of the problem. A second related challenge is that existing communication about air quality suffers from quality issues. News media are an important source of information for many people, and coverage of air pollution in the news tends to focus on the threat without providing efficacy information. In other words, telling people what they're able to do about it. For example, in one study where we looked at news stories about air pollution, my team found that while nearly half of the news articles about air pollution do mention human health risks, fewer than 1 in 10 of them provide any information on how people might be able to reduce their exposure. And that's a critical gap. Why does it matter? Well, without understanding how pollution affects health and what they might be able to do about it, they can't assess their own risk. And this makes people feel powerless and afraid. And this imbalance can lead to what communication scholars call a fear control response. When people feel threatened and they don't have a clear path to action, they respond with denial or avoidance. So people need both information about the threat and action-oriented information. Beyond the information that we learn incidentally, meaning through our routine exposure to the news, the formal forms of communication that we have about air pollution and health risk are rife with misinformation or just plain old ineffective communication. Our current systems for communicating air pollution risk often end up failing because they rely too much on very technical metrics. We use the air quality index, the AQI, colors and numbers, and we assume that the public understands them. It actually takes a fairly high level of cognitive processing ability to understand AQI, because it's really an abstract concept. Many people don't realize that moderate air quality can still harm vulnerable populations. For example, there's also a lack of local real-time data. The AQI updates daily, but pollution levels shift hourly. In California, in the Central Valley, we have the Real-Time Air Advisory Network, the RAN, that provides real-time updates, but very few people know about it, so it's not really up. There's not a huge amount of adoption of that communication form. And then also, and this is really picking up on what Rob mentioned, that most alerts, most communication that we have about air pollution and health threats focus on the immediate risks of acute exposures, like when there's a wildfire event. But ignore the fact that long-term exposure to even low levels of pollution can contribute to cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, preterm births, and all the other bad health outcomes that John mentioned. The burden of air pollution is not evenly distributed. It disproportionately affects low-income communities and people of color. In the San Joaquin Valley, where I live, 70% of the children breathe air that fails to meet federal air quality standards. These exposures put particular communities at higher risk of negative health outcomes, and yet, despite these communities' higher risk of air pollution and health risks, they're much less likely to have access to information about air quality and personal risk mitigation. They're less likely to have the education and the skills to make sense of the information that they do have access to, or to have the finances and job situations that would allow them to engage in the individual level mitigation efforts like staying indoors or running an air purifier all night long. That costs a lot of energy, even if you can afford the filters and the system. And public health messages tend to target the general population rather than particular risk groups, which ends up reducing their effectiveness in addressing risks that disproportionately target certain groups. But I started by saying we're all depressed, so I want to end a little bit on a positive note about what we can do. If we want people to take action, we need to change how we communicate about air pollution. So here are 3 strategies. We need to make air pollution personal, local, and actionable. This means, for instance, that instead of generic AQI alerts, we have personalized risk assessments. We have the technology. This exists, right? We all carry around our little personal computers with us, and they know a lot about us, where we are. They are able to sense, to pull in information from various monitors, and so you could imagine mobile alerts based on your location that could include simple behavior-specific recommendations that someone could engage in. In addition, We need to make sure that we're engaging trusted community voices. Public health messages, we know, are much more effective when they're delivered by trusted local figures. And so we need to really engage with the communities that we're trying to communicate with and figure out who are those trusted figures. Are they the doctors? Are they the teachers? Are they people in various community organizations? And we also need to think about what sources, what media sources people trust. Again, in my work in the San Joaquin Valley, Spanish language radio is the primary source of health information for many residents. And I mean the primary source of health information, right? So they aren't talking to their doctor first, they're getting health information from the radio first. But very few agencies are able to use it effectively. So, finally, we need to reframe the narrative. Messaging about mitigating the health effects of air pollution often end up placing the burden on individuals. So we tell people to stay inside, to wear a mask, to buy an air filter, but not everybody has those options. And air pollution is something that individuals can't fix on their own. It really requires, I love the Wallace Stegner quote, it really requires a community solution, a cooperative solution. So we also need stronger messaging about policy-driven solutions, like communicating about ways to limit the sources of pollution, stricter emissions regulations, expanding public transportation, et cetera. And I just want to leave you with this thought that air pollution is not just an environmental crisis, it's a communication crisis. If people don't understand the risks or what they can do, they're not going to take action. We need clearer, more localized risk communication. We need to reach the communities who are most affected, and we need to shift the burden from individuals to systemic change. When we improve how we talk about air pollution, we empower people to protect their health and push for cleaner air for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susana, and thank you to all of our presenters. So the next portion will be the Q&A, and just a reminder for our audience members that you can submit questions to our panelists via Slido. And I wanted to start with some questions for each of our panelists following Susana's point about the lack of solutions impacting air pollution communication. I wanted to ask Rob, what are some of the best ways for Utahns to protect their health and the health of their loved ones when the air is bad? So we talked about pregnant folks, but what about those who are thinking about having kids, as well as kids and adults who ride their bikes outside?
Okay, so I'm a pulmonary physician. I see patients, all the time in my clinic who have lung issues, and I now incorporate conversation about air quality into every visit we talk about it. And I think there's some really important things that individuals need to be aware of. The first thing I tell them is they need to be aware of what the air quality is around them locally. Now, we're fortunate, our television and radio stations here do a pretty good job as part of the weather every day of saying what the air quality has been and what the air quality is going to be tomorrow. We need people to listen to it. My personal opinion, I hate the air quality index because I want much more granular data than that, but it's something, and to get people listening to that. I think that I also tell people they need to listen to their body. They need to know, they need to pay attention to what the air quality is doing and how they feel, and know when have a plan, know when, if they're feeling poorly, when they need to go actually call their physician, seek help. For those who have health issues, asthma particularly, or cardiac disease, everybody is imperfect in using their medications. When the air quality is bad is the time to be perfect about it and to step up and do those things. And I think that I must say, one of the big questions that always comes up is exercise. I'm a tremendous advocate for exercise. We should all be being more active, getting outside, but you need to pay attention to the air quality and realize when the air quality is poor, exercise indoors. Or if you have the ability, yes, and we have an inversion in the valley, go up into the mountains where you're above it. I think, as John pointed out, ozone varies over the course of the day, and people should adjust their outdoor activities to the morning when it's not so bad and avoid the late afternoon when the ozone's high. All of those little adjustments. I'm an advocate for air filters, changing the air filter on your furnace, but also actually putting in air purifiers if you have these health issues. And I think COVID has taught us all that masks actually are something that is tolerable and you can use, and to use a high-quality mask when the air quality is poor doesn't work on ozone, but it can be very helpful for particulates. And then one last thing that Susana was saying, as you're thinking about your own health, it's a good opportunity to think about advocacy and that ability to influence how air quality is across the region by reaching out and speaking to your representatives and so on.
Thanks, Rob. This next question is for Susana. What is the most effective way to convince folks to take these steps from masks to air filters? Can pictures help? Which entity, public or private, is best situated to improve their communication on air pollution?
That's the $7 million question or whatever that game show was. I think that the AQI is something is, in this case, is better than nothing. But I do think that, well, we have different systems. So we have, in California, we have flags. Do you have flags here at the schools? So the schools will, because we have a very young population, we have a lot of kids in schools, and so the flags correspond to the colors of the AQI. They go up, and that's a way that folks can be aware. The problem with, I don't have an answer. Okay, I have suggestions, but this is an ongoing question. But the problem with a lot of the solutions is that we also need to invest in education about these tools. So making sure that the information is as easy to understand and actionable for the people who need to hear it, who are not experts, and that it is empowering in a way, and it reaches them in the way that they get, right? So if they're listening to the radio, it should be on the radio, and it's currently not reaching all of the populations who listen to the radio and demand the radio. But also, we do need to think about what is it that we are encouraging them to do. I've had N95 masks since before they were cool and then not cool again, because we have asthma in my family, right? And so we have had that. But I think if you're only hearing actions that you cannot take because N95 masks are expensive, or high quality masks are expensive, or you don't have an air purifier, or for a lot of the case in our community, you can't not be outside when the air pollution is bad because you work in the fields, right? And so if the only advice that you get is something that you cannot do for whatever reason, that can backfire in the sense that you are in the sense that the same thing where you feel powerless, right? You're being told to do something, you cannot do it, even if you want to, even if you understand it, even if you know it's the right thing to do. And so this is where I really do think that we need to make sure that we're not only conveying what can you do as an individual to mitigate your own health concerns, but what can we do to not blame the people who are getting sick, but to think about what are these sources of pollution and what can we do to cap them, and who are the people who can help us to fix the sources. That was an unsatisfactory answer, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there are a lot of general strategies, and it's a big question. This third question is for John. What do you think is the long-term solution for winter inversions, assuming that we get less snow as the climate changes? This is a two-part question. Another person in the audience asked, does elevation affect ozone levels? Does it matter where you are in the Wasatch Front?
Yeah, I'll first tackle the first part, which is the wintertime inversion problem. So I mentioned the inversion is an atmospheric phenomenon, warm air on top of cold air. That's pure meteorology. So there are lots of places around the world, mountain valleys especially, that have inversions, but they have fine air quality, they have great air quality. So it's this confluence of the natural phenomena and our human emissions that conspire to create our problems, okay? And of course our mountains that block too. So naturally, we have only control on our emissions. So the way to move forward on the inversion problem, the wintertime PM 2.5, is to try to lower our emissions. And it's pretty simple. Of course, it's hard. What do you exactly regulate? What do you encourage people to do? You know, there's lots of, but that path is pretty clear. And I would say I'm quite heartened. We all have this really amazing goal and big world event, right? The world will be looking at us in 2034 in the Olympics. And all of us want that to be a success. You know, we want that beautiful postcard view of Salt Lake City that I think we had like yesterday. Just spectacular, you know, it's just beautiful, right? And just on the Olympic part again, some of you might remember 2002, there was an inversion right up against the opening ceremonies. There's the storm that brought us, dumped lots of snow. So in some ways, we were very lucky back then. You know, we don't want to count on luck anymore in 2034, but there's a clear path of trying to reduce the emissions. So I think that's the way forward. Your second part question, I believe, is about elevation and ozone, right? Yeah. So clearly, there is an elevation gradient in ozone. Often it's higher in higher elevations. The ozone concentration is higher at higher elevations. So if you think about it, we are at a disadvantage here because we're at high elevation, right? So we start off with what's known as background ozone, higher levels of background ozone. We don't have a lot of room to maneuver for ozone in terms of federal air quality standards. That standard is 70 parts per billion over 8-hour average. Okay, so we unfortunately don't have a lot of wiggle room for that. One can argue, maybe think about, can we have a Clean Air Act where, well, there are parts of the country where you have different levels, but I think I'll leave the lawyers talk about the Clean Air Act. This is probably a hard sell politically to do that. So right now we have this flat standard, 70 parts per billion across the country, and the reality is places like Utah, Wasatch Front have less wiggle room. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So this is more of a personal question for everyone here. What progress has your area of research made in the last few decades on the question of air pollution communication? What keeps you motivated to continue your research? And how has your research affected your own behavior on bad air days in terms of sources that you look at, behavioral changes, possibly laws or policies you're keeping close track of? We'll start with Susana.
I was invited to talk about some of my air pollution communication work in Southern California a few years ago, and Southern Californians really have nothing to brag about, I will say, but, except that the ones who live by the coast, you know, have nice air most of the time. Anyway, and they asked me, it was during a time when the air quality in India had been really, really bad, and there was a lot of communication, a lot of news coverage about air quality. At the time, the news goes through cycles, right? So anyway, they said, how do you feel about continuing to live and raise your young, vulnerable children in a community that is so polluted and is going to harm their health? And I thought, wow, that's such an inappropriate question. But also really, to your question is, I think that the work that I'm doing is really important, and I think that in a like really just to get an academic answer, I think that when you are an academic who is doing work that you hope to impact society, I think that it really is important that you don't just talk about it, but you kind of live there, right? It's walking the talk, or the other, whatever way around it works. So I am encouraged and inspired to do my research, because I see that it is very much needed, and I see the potential for impact. I think that the advocacy, communication, and thinking about refocusing messaging, I think messaging for individuals to mitigate their own health is very important. That area is very important. And also, I think that we need to do a lot more on advocacy, communication, and providing efficacy information that includes how you advocate for solutions to systems level solutions to systems problems.
Thank you. John?
Okay, I think I'll hone in on one point, which is what Susana talked about. I jotted it down. Her first point about make pollution information personal, local, and actionable. So what encourages me is we actually can do that here in Salt Lake City, or actually the Valley, especially Salt Lake Valley broadly, because we have this wonderful array of measurements, from tracks, from the electric buses, to the very important regulatory quality sensors that the Division of Air Quality has. You put all that together, you have knowledge about the winds, you add in AI now, so we probably not far off, maybe just a year off with some investment and some really smart people. You put all that together, we can deliver mobile alerts to people. It's really within our reach, and perhaps we, out of the whole world here in Salt Lake, can make that happen. So that is really exciting for me. And of course, I think you asked about personal behavior. I'm a dad. I'm very important, of course, to protect the health of my family. So I literally check our sensors, our research sensors, each time I look out and say, oh, there's a problem. What is the tracks reading? What is DAQ providing us? So I kind of geek out and I tell my wife, well, let's do this or let's do that. Let's not go play basketball, let's do this. So but that's because I know where to look. I can geek out. Not everyone can do that. So we want to make that really, really at people's fingertips.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Rob?
Well, let me carry forward the personalization theme. I find as I care for patients, the increased information we have about air pollution, how it impacts health, what the local characteristics are, provide great resources that I can apply at the level of the individual patient. We've spent a lot of time talking about how genes impact health. We're now understanding the gene-environment interaction is incredibly important, and we've got richer and richer data about the impacts of the environment. This makes it easier for me to function as a physician and to help my patients. I think I've also been impressed. I have to say, I've been impressed by what advocacy can do and the ability to slowly push things back and to make changes. Air quality in the Salt Lake Valley, although the number of residents has increased tremendously, our air quality has actually, on average, done pretty well. Now, it's done pretty well thanks to the EPA and fuel standards and automotive standards, and we're going to have to continue to fight on that. But I think let's not give up on advocacy even in the current age. And yes, like John, I've influenced my personal behavior, paying attention to what's going on outside and recognizing I'm now part of a vulnerable population and need to listen to my own advice.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. That concludes our panel. Please stay tuned for our next panel.
Thank you, Professor Chenyang, and all of our panelists. I'll give them a moment to reclaim their seats in the audience. So we have two things to do before lunch. The first is I want to take a moment. We have high school students joining us from throughout Salt Lake City and across the valley. If they would maybe just take a moment to stand, we'd like to recognize them. One of the great privileges of being in education is you get to spend time with younger folks, and I can tell you on a daily basis, it gives me hope. And those are really, that's one of the emotions I feel as I stand at this podium today. I'm going to say more about this in a moment, but deep gratitude, determination, and hope. And on the gratitude front, we want to take a few moments now to recognize this as the 30th annual Stegner Symposium, 3 decades of the symposium. I think that deserves a round of applause. So we want to take a few moments to talk about the legacy of the symposium and the Stegner Center itself. And to kick us off to do that, I'm going to welcome to the podium my good friend, colleague, and mentor, Bob Kiter, Distinguished University Professor and Wallace Stegner Center Professor here at Utah Law. Bob.
They just couldn't keep me away from the podium, even though I'm now in the midst of a phased retirement process. But my role is, as Lincoln mentioned, is to offer a few brief remarks about the origins, history of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment. And I guess I'm the right person to do that since I was there, so to speak, at the beginning, which goes back 30 years in terms of the sort of immediate origins, and quite a bit before that in terms of earlier origins. But I'll start 30 years ago when my beard was dark, my hair was dark, I weighed a few less pounds, and Linda and I had arrived here at the University of Utah and the College of Law from the University of Wyoming. The year was 1994. And the dean suggested that we think about rejuvenating the environmental natural resources law program at the law school. I proceeded with several colleagues to meet, to talk about how we might go about doing that. I should add, this was in the year after Wallace Stegner's untimely death. And my colleague, Bonnie Mitchell, came forward and said, hey, Bob, why don't we think about naming a center after Wallace Stegner? That got some traction within the law school, and in turn, rather quickly put me in touch with 3 other individuals who played a formative role in this. They were Dave Livermore with the Nature Conservancy of Utah, Greg Thompson at the Merced Library, and the late Lowell Durham. At this time, Greg was in the process of finalizing arrangements for the transfer of Wallace Stegner's papers from the family and to the Merced Library archives. And he and others introduced me to the Stegner family. That was Mary, Paige, and Lynn. And Allison was on the scene, as I recall, although I suspect suspect she doesn't remember this. I might pause for a second and just acknowledge Lynn and Allison, who are with us today. Thank you for coming. At any event, we were successful in convincing the family that we had a viable vision for a center named after Wallace Stegner. And in November 5th, 1995, we held a sort of a coming out announcement event in tandem with the Merced Library at the Williams building up on the upper side of campus, with the university president, various deans, and other dignitaries to announce both the transfer of the papers and the establishment of the Stegner Center. As I thought about my remarks today, I thought to take a look back at those remarks since they sort of set the stage for where we are today. And I thought I'd share a few passages from those remarks. The College of Law is quite pleased, thrilled may be a better word, to now house the Wallace Stegner Center for Land, Resources, and the Environment, and we thank the Stegner family for this rare opportunity. The center is designed as an interdisciplinary forum for promoting educational and research activities related to natural resources and the environment. Just as Wallace Stegner comfortably wore the labels of teacher, historian, biographer, writer, novelist, mentor, and citizen of the West, and just as he perceptively conveyed the larger picture of Western settlement and development, the Wallace Stegner Center aspires to carry on in that same tradition, to develop meaningful and respected conference series, research publications, and educational programs that see the West and beyond with the clarity and insight that Stegner brought to this task during his lifetime. Whether the center that bears Wallace Stegner's name will be able to lay the same claim in the years ahead is yet to be seen, but in Wallace Stegner's tradition and in the best tradition of the Academy, we can promise to think clearly, examine critically, and write truthfully about the natural resources and environmental matters that confront us today. So that, if you will, was sort of the kickoff for the Stegner Center, and I guess the rest of my task is to do a quick update as to where we may be 30 years later. Very briefly, and skipping over many things and folks who have been major contributors in one way or another to the center, let me highlight a couple of things. First, our first job was to secure financial support for the center, and we were very fortunate initially and since then to be able to secure that support. We did so initially through a seed grant from the Quinney Foundation that enabled us to add administrative support for the center and to help kick some programs off. At the same time, when we launched in 1996, our first symposium, the R. Harold Burton Foundation stepped forward and provided support for that symposium, which was held over at the University Marriott Park Hotel. And we are most grateful that first, they had confidence in us to provide that support, and then subsequently have provided similar support for the last 30 years. And we're most grateful for that. Along the way, we've secured other financial support for a substantial period of time. The Chevron company provided support, and most importantly, the Alternative Vision Fund, the Cultural Vision Fund, and the ESRR foundation has provided critical financial support, all of which has enabled the center over the last 30 years to, among other things, continue this annual symposium tradition, to support and offer other conferences and public programs, to establish a Stegner Center Young Scholar program, and to come forth with a variety of publications, including books, journal articles, white papers, and the list goes on. At the same time, roughly about 10 years ago, we had sufficient financial resources to establish a research program now known as the Stegner Center's Law and Policy Program and an Environmental Dispute Resolution Program, both of which continue today and are quite frankly growing at this point. As a result, where the Stegner Center started with, candidly, a sort of reluctant director, Stegner Center now has 10 full or part-time employees, all of whom are supported by funds from outside of the university or the state, and are doing good work in the programs that I mentioned. Let me conclude, if I can, by going back to the remarks that I made in 1995. Here I conclude those remarks by returning to Wallace Stegner's work on John Wesley Powell. And Stegner provided a description of Powell's achievements that might also be applied to the center's ambitions. Order is a dream of man. It was a dream of John Wesley Powell more than most. The larger synthesis that he attempted in several areas turned out to be always working syntheses only, sure to be periodically discarded and replaced. As the center embarks upon its own journey of discovering for itself today's larger syntheses in the fields of natural resources and environmental thought and policy, we will draw confidently upon the wisdom of our namesake to push our understanding forward. And we shall bear in mind the following words that Stegner also used to describe Powell's efforts, and I might add that seem applicable to our current times. Despite temporary defeats and shocks that rattled a social mover to his ultimate particle, the larger motion was always like that of a comet or a glacier forward. So I look forward to the Stegner Center going forward confidently into the next 30 years. Thank you.
It's always difficult to follow Bob Kiter, with one exception. I will always follow Bob Kiter. Let me just take a few moments. There are a few things we need to say, and just a few places I need to place some emphasis. As I mentioned, I come to the podium this morning with gratitude, determination, and hope. And I have the most, perhaps, to say about gratitude. As one of the new co-directors of the Stegner Center, we stand on a significant and just monumental foundation and legacy in the shadow always of Bob Kiter. It's not a coincidence that it takes two people, my co-director Brigham Daniels and myself, to fill Bob's shoes, because they are enormous shoes. It's also a privilege and an honor to help lead the Stegner Center, and to do so with Brigham Daniels, who we have been friends for about 26 years now. And we're both native Utahns, so we're here because we want to do good for the state, because we want to do good for the center, because we want to do good for the West, and because we want the center to do good for our future. Bob mentioned that when the center began, it was really just him and some affiliated faculty. And I want to take a moment to point out that from that small beginning, what has been created is really a juggernaut, and it is a juggernaut for good. The Stegner Center and its programming is the #3 environmental law program among public law schools in the nation, and the #7 overall. We have an A+ rating, and you've seen some of our incredible faculty already today. The symposium itself and the programming that Bob has been able to pull together over the decades have brought incredible luminaries to our campus and to Salt Lake City, including Bruce Babbitt, Wendell Berry, Jane Goodall, Sally Jewell, Bill McKibben, John Leshy, Charles Wilkinson, and Terry Tempest Williams. The symposium is a gathering of our community and an educational force for good. And it is because of this legacy and great gratitude we have for it that we're determined to continue to do good for the future. Bob mentioned the law and policy program, which is trying to advise the world on how to do better with its laws and policies to advance sustainability and to protect the environment. The Great Salt Lake Project, which has as nothing short of its goal to save the lake, and our Environmental Dispute Resolution Program, which is determined to help people come together to mediate difference and to find common solutions for the environment. I want to take just a moment to recognize our key supporters. Bob mentioned many of these. Throughout the history of the center, the Alternative Visions Fund, the ESRR Endowment Fund for the Stegner Center, Wilberforce, and Richard and Suzanne Burbage. Without the support of these donors and supporters and friends, we couldn't do the good work we do. And we live always in the shadow of Wallace Stegner, and so we're grateful to the Stegner Center family and to Lynn and Allison Stegner for all they continue to do to support us. I also want to take a moment just to focus on the symposium for a second. But again, I'll just say, whenever you do anything with the name of Wallace Stegner attached, you want to live up to that. And that's what we try to do on a daily basis. And I think the same is true of Bob Kiter. I try to live up to what the incredible example he has set. The symposium in many ways is the crown jewel of the Stegner Center. And we wouldn't be able to hold this symposium without the support of our incredible donors, the Cultural Vision Fund, which has been here from the beginning, the Nature Conservancy, and our founding sponsor, the R. Harold Burton Foundation. And I want to take a moment to recognize some of its board members and directors who are here today with us. Fred Morton, who's the chair, Kurt Crowther, the vice chair, Rick Horn, Lucy Morton Haas, Judy Moyle, Christopher Von Mack, and Steve Morgan, their executive director. If I could take just a moment to ask those who are here from the Burton Foundation to stand and be recognized. And with that, I'm going to ask both Brigham Daniels, my co-director, as well as Fred Morton, the chair of the Burton Foundation, to join me at the podium for just a moment for another recognition. Trying to get this open. There we go. So the symposium, as I said, is an incredible legacy, and it wouldn't be possible without the support of the Burton Foundation, who is our founding donor and been with us from the beginning. So I just want to take a moment to recognize them. Fred, we're deeply, deeply grateful. Thank you. Thank you. You can see this small token, it has Utah on it because we're here to do good for Utah.
Like Bob Kiter, I was there 30 years ago when they started, and it's been my pleasure to take a minute to, in recognition of the work that they've done. Thank you, Lincoln and Brigham, for this recognition on behalf of the directors of the R. Harold Burton Foundation. We are so proud of our association with the Wallace Stegner Center and this prestigious symposium. We also congratulate and thank Dr. Robert Kiter for his inspired leadership over the past 3 decades in organizing and hosting the symposium, assisted by the most capable Jan Nystrom. Wallace Stegner once said, "I am terribly glad to be alive, and when I have wit enough to think about it, terribly proud to be a man and an American, with all the rights and privileges that those words connotate. And most of all, I am humble before the responsibilities that are also mine. For no right comes without a responsibility, and being born luckier than most of the world's millions, I am also born more obligated." We at the R. Harold Burton Foundation also feel the responsibility and obligation to give back and make our world a better place. We believe this symposium has brought together great scholars and public servants to tackle some of the most challenging problems. Most recently, the symposium has addressed the water challenges of the Colorado River and the Great Salt Lake, the opportunities with alternative energy sources, and this year's theme on air quality along the Wasatch Front and what we can do to improve it. We are proud to be part of this conservation and collaborations and thank all the contributors who have been part of this important work. Our hope is a meaningful action and results will occur because of this symposium. This is what Wallace Stegner would have expected. Again, thank you for this recognition.
So again, we're so grateful to our supporters. We're grateful to each of you. We're determined to do good, and we find hope being here with you. We hope you will find that as well. Throughout the symposium, because many years ago my daughter turned me into a Taylor Swift fan, there will be a few other Easter eggs you can look for as we celebrate the 30th anniversary. But before we do that, let's get lunch. We'll be back here at 1:25 for our next panel. Thank you.